Hey everyone, good evening. We are here for another I Care for Your Brain science-based lecture. We have been meeting every Wednesday night at 6 o'clock and we are getting ready to finally be able to release our stroke recovery guide on June 5th. We are super excited. About a year and a half ago, I started really thinking about how I could bring my personal style of brain health care to more people. And unfortunately, there are limitations on psychology licenses in the United States, and you're really only able to practice within the state that you're in, and if you have a license in the state where someone else is in. So I wanted to try to find a way to be able to have a personal hand in more people's care, really based on the success of this page. How many of you have told us that this really helped, that you learn more things from me on this page through the style of education that we've been focusing on, which is really trying to make you feel more well-informed, because I know you'll be able to make better decisions about your healthcare once you know better. And unfortunately, the way the medical system is changing these days, you just don't have as much face-to-face time with your provider that you really need or deserve. So unfortunately, I think what we're going to have to start to do is to bring information directly to the people. So I thought, well, I think that the stroke community out there really needs a new type of guide, one that is really based in cutting-edge neuroscience, but has the ability to speak in a language that is understandable and a approach that is personalized, that you can write in the book, you can write down your stroke history, you can be asked certain questions, and by making those prompts personal to you, you're going to get further in your recovery. The way I set it up was by trying to come up with 10 principles of recovery that I'm calling the 10 rules of rehab. And the reason we had to make this kind of broad is because everyone's brain is different to begin with. Everyone's stroke is different. Everyone's stroke recovery, while never ending, is also different. However, there are some basic principles of brain healing, neuroplasticity. So what I've really done in this book is to try to put them all together into my 10 best offerings, that once you understand these principles, you're going to be able to apply them to any post-stroke symptom to work on getting the maximal recovery that you possibly can. So on June 5th, we'll finally be able to make that available to you. And as the weeks go on, as we get closer to the date, we'll be telling you more and more. May is Stroke Awareness Month, as you know, and so we are continuing the theme tonight in our lecture, and we're going to turn the tables and focus on caregivers tonight. These are some of my absolute favorite people. These are people who go so above and beyond some of their abilities as a spouse, as a child, as a friend, to step in and really to play the role of medical providers that can't be there in the way that we want them to. And what I mean by this is by telling us exactly what to do, by giving the therapies that after we've used our 8 sessions of occupational or speech or physical therapy. The people that step in and get people better are caregivers. So tonight is dedicated to one caregiver in particular. This is a beautiful young lady that I've been watching as she's been taking care of her husband, Tony. Her name is Armani, and she is on one of the stroke support groups that I follow closely here on Facebook. And her husband had a traumatic brain injury, and he has been living in a care facility. And if not for the dedication, the intelligence, the kindness, the love, the compassion that this woman had for her husband, you wouldn't believe the strides that he's been able to make. If it was just up to the medical community, I hate to say it, but I think that this man would have been left very incapacitated, might not actually even be living. So she really has brought back so many memories for me of so many caregivers that I've met throughout the years. Some of you might know I started off as a caregiver, so it's really a journey or responsibility that's very close to my heart. And I know that as much as we love people that we take care of, it's also really hard. And so what I wanted to talk about tonight was the caregiver's needs during the inpatient stroke rehabilitation process. And this is a complex topic. I try to do my best to touch on things that I think will be most helpful. But the truth is I've been on that side of the care equation as a doctor, as a neuropsychologist. I have not been there as a patient or as a caregiver. So the way I work in my office, the way I like to offer this program to you is to acknowledge that we are both experts. I hopefully am an expert by going to great colleges and by seeing patients and by being board certified. And you are an expert in either your brain health challenge or as a caregiver, you are really in a position of expertise in knowing what works for your person and in understanding how to best care for them. So as I'm talking tonight, I want this to be interactive. You can probably help somebody by a comment that you might want to make, or if I say something that really resonates with you, I want you to let me know that I got it right, because that's why I work so hard on these lectures, because I want it to matter and mean something to you guys. So I think what's interesting as we start off this lecture is by acknowledging that stroke survivors and stroke caregivers have very similar but also very different experiences, right? There's plenty of ways that they are walking a very similar path, but of course from two different vantage points, two different points of view. They both experience a sudden and oftentimes traumatic out-of-the-blue experience that changes a life in an instant, right? But the change is very different on each side of the fence. For a variety of reasons, the way our healthcare system is really focused on the patient. And we have made some great strides in the way that we are trying to help people with brain health challenges. But I think the reason we're together here is because we both agree we have a lot of room for improvement, right? So thumbs up on that one. I thought this was so interesting in one of the papers that I read, that the way caregivers are really viewed in the hospital setting is not as an individual person who is having their own response to the trauma and their own psychological reality, but really as a resource for the patient, meaning you are there to be the one to get them through to discharge. You are the one that's going to make sure the medications get done the way they need to, right? You are going to be the one that learns to do the feeding tube if need be. But what we need to start focusing on is that caregivers are having an internal experience. Sometimes it has to be stuffed because we don't have any mental or brain space to think about our own selves, because we're so busy focusing on survival. We're so busy figuring out what happened, what are the best things we can do, how am I going to bring this person home? But the truth is that if we just keep focusing on the patient, we're missing a huge opportunity to ultimately help the patient, because the research is telling us that the quality of how we prepare caregivers for discharge has a lot to do with how well people get over time. People with stroke, people who have really informed, well-prepared caregivers do better ultimately. They do better physically, they do better emotionally, they do better socially. And sometimes people have the internal resources to figure this out on their own, and they can go online and find lectures like this, and they can buy all of the equipment for rehab themselves. But for every person who's able to do that, I'm afraid that there's dozens of other people out there who just don't have that ability for whatever reason, be it financial, be it too overwhelmed, not having a supportive family. So tonight our focus is really trying to figure out what are some of the care needs of the caregiver as they go through the stroke inpatient rehabilitation experience. So I want to start off with a question. Remember, I said I want this to be interactive. I don't want to be talking to myself here. So if you were or are a caregiver to someone with a stroke, I want you to tell me, during the inpatient experience, did you feel that your unique needs as a caregiver were addressed? Did you feel that you were given adequate preparation for this new role that you were taking on once the person came home of caregiver? That's really where we have to start, right? What is the experience? I think that the sad truth is that the needs of caregivers are unfortunately largely ignored. The inpatient time is often chaotic, highly stressful, fearful. Many times we're almost in a state of being stunned. There is an instant and massive relationship transition that can happen if, as a caregiver, you are a spouse. Within the blink of an eye, you can go from being a wife to a caregiver, a son to a caregiver. It's an instant role transition. The ability of someone to be a caregiver is something that needs to be nurtured and fostered, and we need to respect that this is a very big role transition. This is just not something that someone magically figures out what to do. There's a lot of growing pains, And that's one of the things that really bothers me is that pain necessary? Or if we can do better as brain health doctors, as a community of people that supports caregivers, can't we learn from each other's journey? There's no reason to be reinventing the wheel for hundreds of thousands of people out there. I'm hoping that by creating communities like this, more and more people can connect and learn from each other. So I think we all agree, you can let me know if you agree with me, that we need so much more personalization in all aspects of brain health care, right? This goes from the experience of the caregiver to being in the emergency room, to being in an inpatient rehab, to outpatient appointments, to therapy. Across the whole spectrum of stroke care, we need to be incorporating the caregiver more and more. There is a big opportunity for advocacy here. And so what we're going to talk about at the end of tonight's lecture is how is it that you can do your part? How can you take your experience and try to make it better for someone else coming down the road? So the first thing I wanted to do is talk to you about, when we say caregivers, who are we really talking about? Well, post-stroke care disproportionately falls on women. That's really not a big surprise. We think about 70 to 80% of caregivers are women. If you're a man that's listening out there, you can give yourself a shout out and we'll all give you a nice heart. And what we get really worried about is that about 3/4 of caregivers say that they are very, very stressed about their role, that they don't feel like they were trained in what to do. They don't really even know if they know how to keep the person safe. There's a big focus on how will I know if they have a medical emergency? What if they have another stroke? Is there anything I can do that will prevent those risks? And again, people are learning this on their own. We're not systematically communicating this information good enough. We know that there are certain subgroups within caregivers that seem to have an even harder time. Typically, the younger you are, probably the more unexpected it is that you would be in this role. People who have their own health issues, specifically pain issues like a bad back or bad knees. We know caregiving is harder on these people. And of course, the more impaired your person is physically, cognitively, sometimes psychiatrically, the harder it is to be a caregiver. We all know this. Of people who've had strokes, about 11% go to long-term care facilities, about 55% go directly home, and about 32% go to an inpatient rehab. So tell me, where did you go? Where did your person go? About 3/4 of these people, these caregivers, of folks with stroke, tell us that it was the hospital stay, the rehab, and the first 1 to 3 months being home that was the hardest. And probably because that learning curve is very, very steep. So a caregiver's experience with stroke really starts the minute you enter the medical system, right? And this is often in the emergency room with the ambulance. These times are almost always completely overwhelming. Things can seem like a blur. The way trauma memories are is they're not very logical. They're not necessarily sequential. Your sense of time can be all messed up. You can remember bits and pieces. It can seem like time is going very slow. It can seem like it all happened in the blink of an eye. Some people even talk about kind of looking at it like they're watching a movie. It almost doesn't seem like it's real. And part of that is how many stress hormones you have coursing through your blood. It just kind of gives it almost this third person perspective. So as we talk tonight, I thought it would be helpful to think about different phases of caregiver needs into 5 different areas as people interact with the stroke healthcare system. So the first one is the event, the diagnosis of stroke. The second one is all the changes that happen in care settings, moving from the ambulance to the ER, to the acute hospital stay, maybe to ICU, to rehab, over to home. The third one is preparing to go home, that experience of preparing for life after the hospital setting when there's no more nurses or doctors. The fourth one is the crisis of discharge. For most people in the research and my patients, tell us that there was a sense of not being prepared, of not knowing enough of what to do to keep the person safe, to keep yourself sane. And the final one is transitioning and really accepting that role of caregiver. So we're just going to quickly go through these. And again, I want you to tell me if anything I'm saying feels like I got it right. If you feel like I got it wrong, please tell me. It matters to me that I'm really mapping on to your personal experience. So within the event of a stroke, I think it's like any other trauma experience, whether it's a car accident, finding out that, someone has passed away. There's this feeling of disbelief. You kind of can't wrap your head around it. This is often the very first phase of becoming a caregiver. There is a lot of focus here on just basic survival. Is my person going to live? It's usually a very short time until we start to understand what has happened. We start to think about or be told what are some of the longer term consequences. But in this first entry into the stroke caregiver world, we're not necessarily thinking about the future. There's some bargaining that can happen here. We just really want the person to be able to make it, right? We want them to survive. Let's think about the care setting once someone is actually in a hospital environment. So you get up out of the ER, you go into the hospital room, you're in the person's in the bed, right? This physical environment, I think, is oftentimes relatively traumatic, okay? You don't have any of your stuff. You don't have a bed as a caregiver. If you're lucky, you get one of these super uncomfortable, cheap plastic recliners that doesn't even hold the whole length of your body. Maybe you get a little mesh pillow. Maybe you get a little bit of a blanket. There's no privacy, right? Your whole life is basically blown up. Can I go to work? Where am I taking a shower? Who am I calling? I think there's just a lot of chaos around coordinating, okay, this is where we are for the foreseeable future. Again, there's a lot of focus on, should I stay in this room with this person? Should I leave? Should I go home to shower? What if when I'm gone, somebody comes to say something important? There's just so many emotions going on, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty. There's not a book by the bed that says, okay, you can leave during this time and that's when we're going to come in and make sure the person has their shower. But if you're back here by 4, that's when we're going to have our team meeting. I think there's this feeling like you need to be there 24/7 to advocate for your person, to get information, because it's a fragmented system all too often, and sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. There's a lot of players. You maybe even have a neurosurgeon. Maybe you, oh, Siobhan, that's just terrible, sleeping on the floor of a hospital. My God, it's just unbelievable how there's already suffering because of this unexpected life event, and then on top of it, some of these hospital systems, it's like you're at a bad hotel, right? Now, I'm not stereotyping because I know there's a lot of places out there that do a very good job, but all too often it's adding more trauma and stress. So the communication barriers really stand out to me. You're in this giant wheel, right? You and your spouse, your parent, the stroke person are in the middle here, right? And all of these spokes are all the different people, and it's like it's your job to keep awareness of everything that's going on, and sometimes it's just not possible. And I think it feels like the medical system is not necessarily befriending you and helping you understand what everybody is doing. So I think there's a lot of just very overwhelming thoughts that happen at this stage. Then in phase 2, as we are changing care settings, once the person's medically stabilized, then, you're finally getting used to that room. Okay, well, maybe now you're going to go to a facility. Maybe now you're going to go to inpatient rehab. Inpatient rehab is a really tough time because there's almost this feeling like, man, somebody has to really fit in this very finite space in order to benefit. So you can't be too bad, right? You can't be too impaired, but you also can't be too good. So we need you to be able to do 3 hours a day of intensive physical rehab, or else you don't qualify to get intensive therapy to get better. That seems really unfair to me, really unfortunate. We need to have stroke rehab programs that address all levels of ability after a stroke, right? And I think, Armani, you are the perfect example. I know that Tony has been turned down from multiple intensive inpatient rehabs because he can't do the 3 hours. But that's crazy. You are working with him in his room, and look at the strides that he's made from you doing an hour here, 20 minutes here, even 5 minutes here makes a difference. It really, really does. So that, I think, is a very frustrating experience for most people, feeling like you almost have to be a beast, a warrior to fight for your person to get rehab. And the truth is, who's making those decisions? Insurance companies. this whole word of medical necessity, right? Who are the decision makers about what happens to your loved one? I think not having that power is unbelievably heartbreaking and so frustrating. Very, very difficult. And this really leads into this whole concept of length of stay, right? And so this is crazy how this has changed over the years. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this. So let's face it, what is inpatient rehab driven by? Insurance payments, right? So in the United States, starting about in the 1980s, they started to cut days more and more. So in the 80s, there was a study where they looked at 3,000 people who had stroke. And what they were showing was that the time in the hospital, which had typically before been about 18 to 20 days, was now getting cut to 5 to 6 days. 5 to 6 days. So the way the research literature writes about people leaving hospital or rehab with stroke nowadays is they call them discharging people quicker and sicker. And I think that that is so horrible. And I think you would all agree with me if you're out there watching this and your lives have been personally impacted by stroke. That is so much extra stress, that feeling like we're not ready to bring this person home. I'm not ready to take care of them. I don't know what I'm doing. There's not enough training that goes into preparing people. So I want to know from all you guys watching right now, if you brought your person home, did you feel that you were ready? Did you feel that you were capable, that you had been supported enough in order to bring this person home safely? When we are in the rehab setting, what the research tells us is that the stress of the patient is the stress of the caregiver. And I think that speaks to how good and loving caregivers are in that setting. We know that caregivers in inpatient rehab or nursing facilities are consumed with what is the experience of my loved one? What is their quality of life? Are they in pain? If they have aphasia, can they understand me? What do they want to tell me? It's a time of real heartbreak if we don't feel like we are connected in the same way that we're used to being connected. This can also be a crazy time for family dynamics to go off the rails, right? Hospital experiences and medical crises can bring out the best in people and, let's face it, also the worst of people. So if you had some family conflict before, you get these people in a hospital room and there are some people with big old opinions about what should happen. And many times those people aren't also the ones stepping up to be a part of the caregiver experience. When we're starting to talk about discharge, there can be very big opinions about what should happen to the person. But oftentimes those people with the biggest opinions are also not there to do some of the actual heavy lifting of caregiving. So what would lower the stress of people in these situations? Well, how about being included in all team meetings? How about going to therapy sessions with the person, feeling like they're getting enough and adequate therapy that's actually personalized to them and their lives and their interests? Being told that we're going to make sure you know about discharge. We're going to know exactly what day it is, when it's happening. We're going to set up all these services for you. You're going to come back and see us in a week. Support. I mean, I really don't think that it should be that difficult. There was one research study where people said when they left the hospital, they felt like they were thrown off of a cliff. This is unacceptable. We cannot continue to have people feel like this after a stroke. It's basically taking a very unfortunate, traumatic life experience and making it 10 times worse. And I think it's the responsibility of brain healthcare providers like myself to advocate for a change. Part of what I'm doing is being out here kind of on my own in my own practice, trying to do things the way that I think is ethical, and by being here with you guys every week, trying to get some good information out there. But the truth is, we're also going to have to work as advocates together. And I think those of you who have walked in these shoes as caregivers, you really have a cool opportunity to do some communicating about what you didn't like about your inpatient experience and what could be done better. So by the end of our talk tonight, we're going to talk about exactly what that is. So as you start to prepare to go home, right, you're starting to realize that there are some care needs that are happening to your person that are now going to be your responsibility, right? Keeping this person clean, maybe shaving them. I mean, how many of you ever shaved a man before you had to take care of your loved one? advocating for the person's well-being, making sure they don't have another stroke. There's just so many things that are on the shoulders of caregivers that I think are just not discussed, okay? There are some talks about, how many steps do you have to get in your house? Do you need a ramp? Do you need a wheelchair? We focus so much on the physical, and of course there are needs there and we need to do that. But we also need to be preparing caregivers psychologically for taking on this new role, right? We need to be talking about how are they going to manage their own mental health needs? How are they going to manage negotiating a new relationship with their person? How are they going to resolve conflict? How are they going to take care of this person without the person feeling like they're babying them or they've lost all their independence? There are skills that we can put forth into caregiving to really communicate respect and help with independence, but people figure these things out on their own. We're not systematically teaching caregivers how to do this, and this is not okay. So then we start to approach the discharge crisis. I have heard so many caregivers say they didn't even know what the plan was for discharge. They came in one day and there was a social worker starting to say the D word, okay? Discharge, you're going home. Wow, okay, well, I'm gonna have to figure out the feeding tube. Like I said, maybe there's new glasses, an AFO. Bedrooms might have to be moved from a second floor down to a first floor. If we look at the caregivers who have the lowest amount of stress during the discharge period, they seem to have three things in common, okay? The first one is they recognize their limits. Okay, they realize, I have a bad back, I can't lift him. And they communicate assertively these limits to the medical team. They are working to let people know that I need more training, okay? I'm afraid that I'm not gonna be able to handle this. But in the caregivers that do this, do you know what they also struggle with? Guilt. They feel terrible that they're not just accepting this big responsibility with total and complete grace. They feel guilty that they have care needs, and we have to empower caregivers. You're gonna have to be a squeaky wheel if you really wanna be able to do this and survive well, to be able to actually thrive. So a lot of people, as they leave the inpatient stroke rehabilitation setting, have a big sense of disappointment. I think people thought their loved one was going to get better during rehab, and there's this feeling now of, is this the new chapter? Is this our new normal? And there's not necessarily a plan for comprehensive outpatient therapy. And we all know that the insurance clock is ticking. We all know that we are limited to so many sessions per year. And I think people feel very strongly like maybe their person is not going to get as good as they could if they had more therapy support. And again, that's exactly why I wrote the stroke recovery guide, because I think if people can understand some basic principles of brain healing, it's really going to be on us to try to get our people better ourselves. That's the way it's happening now. I just don't think we have enough resources to support this as well as we should. There is a lot of research going on right now with what they call caregiver readiness, and I do think some hospital programs are getting better at this. And basically this is just, having groups, meeting with other caregivers who have walked in your shoes before, learning from their experience. And this one research program, what they did is they gave people training. They kind of gave them this optimal inpatient caregiver experience where they had them at team meetings. They made sure they felt like they were a part of the decision-making process about discharge. And lo and behold, these people had way less stress, way less poor health outcomes. Their stroke survivors did better. So one of the ways that they measured how prepared people were was by something called the preparedness for caregiver stress. And I wanted to just read you some of these questions because I want you to reflect on your own experience as you were ready to leave the inpatient rehab setting. I want to know, how well prepared did you feel to take on your loved one's physical needs? Okay, so you can write in a little bit here and you can tell me, not at all prepared, very well prepared. How well prepared did you feel to take care of their emotional needs? Not at all, very well. How well prepared did you think you were to find out and set up services for them? Not prepared, very well prepared. How well prepared do you think you were for the stress of caregiving? How well prepared do you think you were to make caregiving activities pleasant for both you and the stroke survivor? How well prepared did you feel to respond to or handle emergencies that happened to your person? How well prepared do you think you were to help and get information you needed from doctors or the healthcare system? Overall, how prepared do you think you were to care for your loved one? So these are the targets. These are the things that we have to work on to have caregivers have a better experience. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here and I feel like a bit of a broken record, but the truth is there's the stress and the trauma of the stroke and the inevitable, the emergency hospital care, the deficits, the impairments, the heartbreak. But then I'm convinced there's another layer of suffering on top of that, which is the medical system, which is not doing enough to support patients and caregivers. So by having this conversation tonight, I hope that it just gives us all some food for thought and for recognizing the important role of advocacy, right? So if you have not had a great ideal experience, I really think that it's upon us to communicate this back to the medical system. So what do I mean by this? Okay, when you feel like you have some extra energy, you're not as overwhelmed, when things stabilize around your house or in your facility, what we really need to be doing is getting in touch with patient advocates at these hospitals. There are people who are in these roles specifically. We need to be writing letters explaining, I am a real person. This thing really happened to me. If I didn't do X, Y, and Z, my loved one may still be in a facility, but through my own ingenuity and my stubbornness and my care, I advocated for my person to get extra therapy, and look where they are now. I made sure that my person, had that hospital bed coming home, but it wasn't because your staff helped me get it. These are the things I had to do on my own, and this is how it hurt me. This is how it made my stroke experience as a caregiver worse. These are the things that I recommend that you try to do, that you try to get into your budget in the future to help make people like me's experience better, to make our lives a little bit easier. You want to encourage them to have caregiver preparedness classes. We need to have a structured program where we actually teach people how to be caregivers. Some people do have a very natural, empathetic ability to connect and to selflessly give care. Some people have some medical background, some nursing background, but this is not everyone. We really need to help give some very basic skills of how to care for someone else and how to care for ourselves to all people that are leaving the rehab center with someone with a stroke. This is a really big one for me. We have got to get better at sharing more medical information with caregivers. And again, this is a big part of my stroke recovery guide. This is why it's interactive, because I have scripts in there for going and talking to doctors and essential information that you should know, that you have a right to know, that make a difference for what kind of rehab you do for your person. You need to know where they had their stroke in their brain. What does that part of the brain do in all its capacities? Why did the person have this stroke? What can we do to prevent a second stroke? This really should be the bare minimum that we offer our patients and caregivers in the hospital setting, but it's just a function of the way medical systems are set up right now. Providers, believe me, I think a lot of providers have a good heart. They got into clinical care for a good reason, but the medical system is broken. It is a volume game. They demand that we see so many patients as doctors that I think people get burned out. And I think because of the documentation requirements nowadays, we just do not have enough face-to-face time with people. We also don't have money in the budgets for people that are coordinators. Some of the best people in stroke rehabs are the discharge planners, the social workers, right? Because they try to provide umbrella services. They try to bring everything together. One of the problems I see is we have these amazing specialists, but they kind of keep their focus on something so specific that they don't see how what they're doing impacts the person's whole care. So we need more coordinating and advocacy positions within stroke care to be able to tie it all together. If you had one contact person that you could go in and say, okay, I need you to tell me what exactly occupational therapy was doing, what exactly is in this feeding tube that I'm going to be giving the person, just one person that kind of had all of the care coordinated within one planner, within one file for you, I think that that would really relieve a lot of suffering. That's just my idea. You guys have walked in these shoes. Please tell me what your experience is. What do you think hospital systems could be doing better to make you feel less stress as a caregiver? So if this was helpful for you, if you think that I'm onto something here, we need to start a big conversation about the needs of caregivers. It just feels so unnecessary to me. There's so much pain and suffering, and this is just a layer that I think is our responsibility as medical providers to do it better and to do it different, but it's really gonna take a public outcry to have people write letters, to talk to decision makers, and to try to get more money in the budget to support these coordinating and these caregiver preparedness programs. So if you can share this on your Facebook page or with any stroke support groups, I would really, really appreciate it. I will be back with you next Wednesday, and what we're going to talk about there is the care team that is needed in stroke recovery. There are so many different professionals out there that do very specific things, and I want to make sure you know every single type of rehab professional, clinical professional, brain health professional that you possibly should be considering in order to have the best recovery that you possibly can. So thank you guys so much for being here with me. I really enjoy researching these lectures. I'm really appreciative that you all are out there listening. I think that there's just a huge need to have more in-depth and higher quality conversations about brain health. I'm worried that we're getting too quippy, that we're relying on things like articles in magazines and sometimes even commercials. It's just not good enough. We all really deserve a much more scientific and comprehensive approach to brain health care. So when you guys are here with me and you like this and you share this, it lets me know that you agree with me and you think that we're onto something and that we should keep going. So thank you all so much, and I'll be psyched to see you next Wednesday. Take care. Bye-bye.